At 20 years old, Mike lived a life of disciplined, relentless forward motion. His world was the wrestling mat, a 6-inch thick square of vinyl and foam where he had forged an identity through sweat, pain, and an unbreakable will. As the star athlete of his university's wrestling team, he was more than just a competitor. He was a machine, finely tuned for a single purpose: winning the NCAA championship. His full-ride scholarship was his ticket out of a life of struggle, and he guarded it with a ferocity that left little room for weakness or distraction. His teammates saw him as a leader, his coach saw him as a champion in the making, and Mike saw himself as a man on a mission that required him to be invincible. The first sign that his body was not as invincible as his mind appeared not during a grueling match, but in the quiet, steamy aftermath of a morning shower. As he ran a towel over the back of his neck, his fingers brushed against a small, hard lump just below his hairline, right over the powerful muscle of his trapezius. It was no bigger than a pea, firm and painless. He prodded it, trying to gauge its nature. A swollen lymph node from overtraining? A simple cyst? He dismissed it with the same mental toughness he used to push through the final period of a match. His body was constantly bruised and strained. This was just another minor, insignificant anomaly that would resolve itself. But it didn't resolve itself. Over the next 2 weeks, the lump began a slow, insidious process of growth. It remained hidden beneath his hair and the high collar of his gear, a secret he kept from everyone. The thought of seeing a team doctor filled him with a cold, calculated dread. A doctor would ask questions, run tests, and might, in the name of caution, declare him unfit to compete. Being benched, even for a week, was unthinkable. The championship season was approaching its climax, and his rivals were not going to wait for him. Admitting to an ailment felt like admitting to a flaw in his design, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. So he chose the path of denial, a silent gamble that the problem would simply vanish. It was during a particularly intense practice that his silent gamble began to unravel. He was locked in a fierce grapple with his training partner, every muscle straining as they rolled across the rough surface of the mat. The friction was immense. His partner's forearm pressed hard against the back of his neck, grinding the skin directly over the hidden lump. Mike felt a sharp, stinging sensation, like a severe mat burn, but ignored it, pushing through the pain to finish the drill. When he got back to the locker room, he saw a raw, angry red scrape directly over the lump, the skin broken and weeping a clear fluid. It was a common enough injury in wrestling, and he treated it as such, splashing it with water and dabbing it with a towel before pulling on a hoodie. That scrape, however, was a critical turning point. It was an open door, an invitation for the bacteria teeming in the hot, sweaty environment of the wrestling room to bypass his skin's defenses. The lump, already a site of underlying inflammation, was now compromised. Within 48 hours, the nature of the pain changed. It was no longer a dull pressure but a deep, persistent, and hot throbbing that radiated from the lump into his neck and shoulders. The area became exquisitely tender to the touch, and the lump itself felt larger, softer, and angrier. He started taking ibuprofen around the clock, telling himself it was just a stubborn infection from the mat burn. He became an expert at hiding it, tilting his head just so when talking to his coach, avoiding any horseplay with his teammates that might involve a friendly slap on the back or neck. The lie was no longer passive. It was an active, exhausting performance. And beneath his skin, a silent, microscopic war was raging. A war he was beginning to lose. The coach believed that champions were built not just on the mat, but through shared hardship. This philosophy led to the team's annual tradition, a grueling, off-season hike through the rugged terrain of a nearby state park. For Mike, the timing could not have been worse. The idea of a 10-mile trek under the hot sun felt like a death sentence. The throbbing in his neck was now a constant, malevolent presence, and a low-grade fever had settled deep in his bones, leaving him feeling perpetually chilled and weak. Yet, backing out was not an option. It would be an admission of weakness he couldn't afford to make. So, on a sweltering Saturday morning, he swallowed a handful of painkillers, pulled on a baseball cap to shade his face, and joined his teammates at the trailhead. A forced smile plastered on his face. The first mile was deceptively easy, a gentle incline that lulled him into a false sense of security. But as the trail grew steeper and more unforgiving, his body began to betray him. While his teammates joked and pushed ahead, Mike found himself falling to the back of the pack, his breathing ragged and his legs feeling like lead. The sun beat down relentlessly, and every heartbeat sent a searing pulse of pain through the swollen mass on his neck. Sweat poured down his face, not just from the exertion, but from the fever that was steadily climbing. He felt a dizzying wave of nausea and had to stop, leaning against a tree and pretending to tie his shoelace until the world stopped spinning. "You okay, Mike?" One of his teammates called back. "Yeah, man," he gasped, forcing a grin. "Just didn't hydrate enough last night." He pushed onward, driven by pure, stubborn pride. It was during a particularly treacherous scramble up a rocky incline that the inevitable happened. As he pulled himself up over a ledge, the strain on his neck and shoulders was immense. He felt a sudden, sickening release of pressure at the back of his neck, followed by an immediate wave of warmth that soaked the collar of his shirt. A foul, coppery smell filled his nostrils. The abscess had ruptured. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through his feverish haze. He stumbled, deliberately scuffing his hands and knees on the rocks. I'm good," slipped on some loose dirt. He yelled to the others, quickly pressing a hand to his neck. Trying to hide the foul-smelling fluid that was now oozing from the open wound, he desperately needed to clean himself up, to assess the damage, but he was surrounded. He lagged further and further behind until, at a fork in the trail, he let the main group go ahead, promising to catch up after a short break. The moment he was alone, he sank to the ground behind a thicket of bushes, his body trembling uncontrollably. He peeled the wet fabric of his shirt away from his skin. The wound was far worse than he imagined, a gaping, angry crater oozing a thick, yellowish discharge. And in the humid, still air of the forest, the scent of infection acted as a beacon. The ever-present buzzing of insects intensified. Green bottle flies, drawn by the irresistible promise of decay, began to land on his neck. He was too exhausted, too dizzy and sick to even swat them away. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and in that fever-induced stupor, he was completely unaware of the tiny, pearlescent eggs being deposited in the warm, moist cavity of his wound. His attempt to stand was a failure. The world tilted violently, his vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. The sepsis, which had been simmering in his body for days, had finally launched an all-out assault. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the forest floor, his last conscious thought a silent, desperate curse at his own foolishness. He lay there, hidden from the trail, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon. It was only when the team regrouped at the end of the trail and realized their captain was missing that the real panic began. A search party was quickly formed, their calls of his name echoing through the darkening woods. They found him half an hour later, unconscious and dangerously still, his face pale and his breathing shallow. When they carefully rolled him over, their shouts of relief died in their throats, replaced by gasps of pure horror at the sight of the raw, suppurating wound on his neck and the swarm of insects that had claimed it. The frantic shouts of Mike's teammates, once full of hope, turned to choked cries of panic and disbelief. They were wrestlers, trained to dominate and control, but they were utterly powerless in the face of this grotesque medical emergency. The sight of their captain, unconscious, pale, with a festering, fly-covered wound on his neck, was a horror beyond their comprehension. One of them, a quick-thinking freshman, overcame his shock and fumbled for his phone, his voice trembling as he tried to explain their remote location and the severity of the situation to the 911 dispatcher. The rescue would not be simple. They were miles from any accessible road, and darkness was falling fast. The arrival of the wilderness paramedics felt like an eternity later. They were a beacon of calm competence in a sea of youthful panic. With practiced efficiency, they assessed Mike's condition, their faces grim as they noted his dangerously low blood pressure, thready pulse, and raging fever. He was deep in septic shock. The wound on his neck was unlike anything they had seen outside of a medical textbook. It was a swollen, purplish mound of flesh, ruptured and seething. They worked quickly, administering oxygen, starting a high-flow 4-line to push fluids and powerful antibiotics directly into his system, and carefully immobilizing his neck, fearing a potential spinal injury from the fall. The extraction was a precarious and exhausting ordeal, a slow, careful journey back down the treacherous trail with Mike strapped to a specialized stretcher, his life hanging precariously in the balance. The transition from the wild chaos of the forest to the structured chaos of the hospital emergency room was instantaneous. A trauma team was waiting, and the moment the ambulance doors burst open, Mike was swept into a world of bright lights, beeping machines, and urgent, clipped commands. He was no longer Mike, the wrestling champion. He was an anonymous patient, his identity temporarily erased by the critical nature of his condition. His coach, who had rushed to the hospital, could only watch from a distance as a team of doctors and nurses swarmed around Mike's gurney, cutting away his soiled clothes and hooking him up to a constellation of monitors. The doctor in charge was a man named Dr. Ramirez, a seasoned physician with calm, dark eyes that had seen every imaginable form of human suffering. He assessed the life-threatening sepsis first, calling for blood cultures and ordering a battery of tests. But his focus, his deep and immediate concern, was the source of the infection. A nurse carefully cleaned the area around the wound, revealing the full, horrifying extent of the abscess. It was a massive, indurated carbuncle, larger than a fist, stretched taut over the delicate area where the neck meets the spine. Dr. Ramirez's professional composure didn't waver, but a new, more profound gravity settled on his face as he pulled the coach aside, his voice low and direct, stripped of any comforting platitudes. His systemic infection is severe, and we're treating it aggressively. But that's not my biggest fear right now, he said, gesturing towards the unconscious Mike. This abscess, its location is a worst-case scenario. It's sitting directly over his cervical spine, near the C7 vertebra. The sheer pressure from a mass of this size could be causing compression on his spinal cord. But if that infection has tracked deeper, if it has penetrated the fascia and reached the epidural space. He let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken implications terrifyingly clear. We could be looking at a spinal abscess, meningitis, permanent nerve damage, paralysis. The word, so alien to a world of elite athletes, landed with the force of a physical blow. The doctor's final words were a chilling verdict. We have to decompress it. Now, before it's too late. A nurse began to prepare a sterile field around Mike's neck, readying the scalpels and drainage tubes. The team braced themselves, preparing to drain a horrific infection, believing the only thing they had to fight was the bacteria within. They had no idea that a far more shocking discovery was waiting just beneath the skin. The atmosphere in the trauma bay grew tense and focused. The beeping of the monitors provided a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet, purposeful movements of the medical team. Dr. Ramirez, now gowned and gloved, stood over Mike, the bright surgical light glinting off the polished steel of the scalpel in his hand. His objective was clear and brutal: to incise and drain the massive abscess, releasing the pressure that was a direct and immediate threat to Mike's spinal cord. He knew what to expect: a torrent of foul-smelling pus and necrotic tissue, a biological testament to an infection that had spiraled catastrophically out of control. The coach stood in the corner of the room, a silent, helpless spectator, his face a mask of anguish. With a steady hand, Dr. Ramirez made the first incision. The scalpel sliced through the taut, inflamed skin, and the initial release was exactly as he had predicted. A thick, putrid fluid erupted from the opening, its rancid odor filling the room. It was the grim, familiar reality of a severe abscess. But as the initial torrent subsided and the doctor widened the incision to allow for better drainage and exploration, he paused, his brow furrowed beneath his surgical cap. Something was wrong. Something was fundamentally different about the contents of this wound. That it wasn't just a homogeneous slurry of pus and dead cells. There was movement, a subtle, yet undeniable, writhing from deep within the cavity. A nurse who was assisting him saw it too and let out a small, stifled gasp. As Dr. Ramirez used his instruments to gently probe and open the abscess further, the full, unbelievable truth was revealed. The core of the wound was not a stagnant pool of infection, but a teeming, living colony. Dozens of white, segmented larvae, maggots, were methodically working their way through the decaying tissue, their bodies churning in a grotesque, mesmerizing dance of consumption. The sight was so profoundly shocking. so utterly out of place in the sterile, controlled environment of a modern hospital that for a moment, the entire team was frozen in a state of collective revulsion. This wasn't just an infection. It was an infestation, a violation of the most primal kind. The coach turned away, his stomach heaving. But Dr. Ramirez, after his initial, reflexive jolt of shock, did not look away. Instead, he leaned in, his mind racing, trying to process the scene not with disgust, but with the cold, analytical logic of a diagnostician. He saw the larvae, but he also saw what they were doing. They were voraciously consuming the blackened, necrotic flesh, leaving the healthy, pink tissue at the wound's base completely untouched. The abscess, while massive, was bizarrely, impossibly clean on the inside. Then he noticed something else, a detail that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The larvae were not just cleaning. They had burrowed. They had created a network of small, intricate tunnels that led from the deepest part of the abscess cavity outward to the original rupture point. A sudden, brilliant flash of understanding hit him. The pressure, the one thing he had feared most, the buildup of fluid pressing down on the spinal cord, had been mitigated. These creatures, in their relentless feeding, had inadvertently created a natural, continuous drainage system. They had acted like 1,000 tiny, living surgical drains, channeling the pus away from the critical spinal column and out through the opening in the skin. He looked up at his stunned team, his voice filled with a sense of awe that bordered on reverence. "Don't you see?" he said, the realization dawning on him fully. He should be paralyzed. The pressure in a closed-space abscess of this size and location, it should have crushed the nerves. But it didn't. He pointed with his forceps into the wound. They saved him. These things have been relieving the pressure, draining the infection away from his spine for days. The horrifying creatures that had infested Mike's body, the sight of which had made them all recoil in disgust, had been the very thing preventing a catastrophic, life-altering injury. They were not the core of the problem. They were the gruesome, improbable, and miraculous solution. The wrestler's career, and his ability to ever walk again, had been saved by nature's most reviled cleanup crew. The revelation in the trauma bay shifted the course of Mike's treatment from a desperate fight against infection to a delicate and respectful collaboration with it. Dr. Ramirez and his team now faced a challenge not found in any medical textbook: how to safely conclude the work that nature had so gruesomely, yet effectively, begun. The procedure became less of an excavation and more of a meticulous cleaning. With a gentle, low-pressure saline wash, they carefully irrigated the wound, dislodging the larvae and washing them away. Each one that was removed was a testament to the improbable biological mechanism that had saved Mike's future. Once the cavity was clear, Dr. Ramirez could fully appreciate the marvel beneath. The wound was pristine, free of the necrotic tissue that would have otherwise required extensive surgical debridement. The foundation for healing was already perfectly laid. When Mike finally surfaced from the depths of his septic delirium several days later, his first conscious sensation was a profound, aching weakness. The world came into focus slowly. The sterile white ceiling tiles, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the unfamiliar weight of clean hospital sheets. His coach was asleep in a chair in the corner, his face etched with lines of worry Mike had never seen before. He tried to move his head, and a dull, manageable pain radiated from the back of his neck. He cautiously wiggled his fingers, then his toes. Everything responded. He wasn't paralyzed. The wave of relief was so overwhelming it felt like a physical force, leaving him breathless. It was Dr. Ramirez who later sat by his bedside and explained the full, staggering story. He started with the severity of the sepsis, the rupture of the abscess, and the critical danger it had posed to his spinal cord. He didn't spare Mike the hard truth, explaining how his own fear and pride had brought him to the very edge of a catastrophic, life-altering injury. Then, with a calm, steady voice, the doctor described what they had found inside the wound. He told Mike about the infestation, watching as the young man's face paled with disgust. But then he explained the miracle of the natural drainage. The way the larvae had methodically cleaned the dead tissue, and, most importantly, relieved the deadly pressure on his spine. Mike listened in stunned, horrified silence. The two driving forces of his life, his relentless pursuit of physical perfection and his terror of showing weakness, had collided in the most ironic way imaginable. He had nearly sacrificed his body to protect his identity as a champion, only to be saved by the most repulsive creatures he could imagine. The very thing he would have considered a mark of filth and decay had been his salvation. It was a paradox so profound it shattered his entire understanding of strength and vulnerability. The invincibility he had so desperately tried to project was a fragile illusion. His actual survival had depended on a gruesome biological accident. His recovery was a long and humbling process. The physical healing of the wound was straightforward, thanks to its surprisingly clean state. But the emotional and psychological healing was far more complex. He had to face his coach and teammates, not as their invincible captain, but as a young man who had made a foolish, nearly fatal mistake. He had to learn to accept help, to admit pain, and to understand that true strength wasn't the absence of weakness, but the courage to confront it. 6 months later, a prominent scar remained on the back of his neck, a permanent reminder of his ordeal. He had lost a season of wrestling, but he had gained a perspective that no championship could ever provide. He eventually returned to the mat, his movements just as powerful, but his mindset forever changed. The scar was not a mark of shame. It was a testament to his survival, a silent, humbling story of how his life was saved not by his own strength, but by the horrifying, miraculous, and utterly unpredictable forces of nature.